we are really honored to have Dr. Wendy Smith, who is a professor at the University of Delaware. But also, I want to say it's an extra special honor tonight to be joined by her, two of her three children, her teens, Jonah Smith-Posner and Yael Smith-Posner, because tonight we really wanted to start, before we started to navigate politics with our teen, we wanted to start with listening to our teens. I know that the generational differences are pretty serious. When I talk to my parents, we can talk about the same kinds of media. I know that my father will ask me, did you read Thomas Friedman's latest piece, for example? And I will know exactly what that is. But I remember when my kids really started in middle school, they started to watch YouTube channels that were comments on the news that I had no idea even existed. And I realized that all of my kids got their news from different sources that I get my news from. So I just want to say navigating politics is an incredibly new challenge because of the different kinds of media environments that parents and teens are often in. I think that's part of it, but that's not the only thing that we really want to talk about tonight. The heart of Dr. Smith's work is the idea of paradoxes in our lives. And she has a beautiful TED Talk about paradoxes. And paradox is really at play when we start to think about politics and how we talk about politics. But before we get there, I want to introduce you to the two teams that are with us tonight. So I'm going to ask that Jonah and Yael come on with me here now, so we can get to know you and hear a little bit about your perspective on tonight's topic. So first, let's just meet y'all. Yael, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about where you go to school, the activities that you're involved in, and maybe a little bit about what you're thinking about for your future. Yael, go for it.
Hi, I'm Yael. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior at Abington Friends School, which is a private Quaker school in Philly suburbs. In school, I run the Jewish Affinity Group. We call it clerking. So I'm the clerk of Jewish Affinity Group. Women's Empowerment Club. I sit on the Diversity Council as well. Outside of school, I'm on the youth group board at my synagogue. I work at religious school. I'm a camp counselor, and I'm a Moving Traditions Koleinu teen leader. When I'm
Yay.
not leading stuff, I'm on stage.
Amazing. And you also were in Rosh Hodesh,
I
the
was in Rosh
tradition Rosh
Hodesh
Hodesh.
too.
Amazing, amazing. Great. Let's turn to your brother. Jonah, tell us a little bit about like where you're in school, what you're doing, and what you're involved in.
Hey, I'm Jonah. I'm a senior at Masterman High School, which is a public high school in Philadelphia. I am really into robotics and engineering. I'm the chief engineer of the robotics team at Masterman. And I am one of the founders of what we call the JSEC this year. It's the Jewish Student Events Committee. We help plan Jewish events for the community of Masterman. And outside of school, I do rock climbing. I love the Rubik's Cube. I play guitar. And I was also part of one of the Rosh Hodesh groups with Moving Traditions.
Oh yeah, I remember you were in the Shevet group with Andrew Davies.
Yeah.
That's great. Amazing. So it's really great to have you here with us tonight. I really want to start with asking you both to reflect on your political lives. So if you could go back to like thinking about your middle school self when you were first becoming aware of the political world, and how people can get into really serious arguments about politics. So when you think back to your middle school self and how you dealt with that kind of conflict, what comes up for you? I wanted to start with you, Yael. When you think about that time in your life, what do you remember?
Yeah. I think in middle school, I was finding my voice. And for me, that meant using it every single second I had the chance. I tried to do everything. And that's overwhelming. One thing I've learned since then is sometimes you just gotta do your math homework and pretend the world isn't maybe about to end at any minute, or that's how it felt like.
So
Um,
you felt like at that time you would be confronting people, you would just say what you felt and just were more confrontational, I guess.
Definitely. I wanted to pick a battle when I saw an injustice being done, or and I also wanted to engage in every opportunity that I could.
Got it. So how did things change as you went into high school?
Yeah. I think what I've learned since then is it's actually not feasible to do everything, and that doing some things and doing them well and wholeheartedly is how I can make a difference. I think that the idea of teenagers being lazy is stupid. I don't think teens are lazy. I think that we care so much, and we care so much about so many things that we don't necessarily know how to change, and that caring so much is paralyzing. Um, I like to think of the Lo Alecha quote, which is, I'm not required to finish the work, but neither am I free to abandon it. And I think that really guides me of it is a both and. I have to both engage in the work. I can't excuse myself from that. And I have to take the pressure off my shoulders to be RBG or Greta, because I think that we hold ourselves to standards when we hold ourselves to standards that are too high, we just get stuck, or at least I do, and I did.
So one of the things I'm hearing is that as you went into high school, you had to think, okay, I can't be politically active every single second. I've got to make choices about when I'm going to do it. And I'm I'm not necessarily going to be like, the hero of everyone. I may be doing politics in a way that may be a little bit more low key or behind the scenes. Is that a
Absolutely.
accurate way? Did I hear you?
There's another quote that I really like to think about, which is, I think it's from Alcoholics Anonymous, but it's, grant me the courage to accept grant me the courage to change the things I cannot accept, the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I really take that quote to be like, in middle school, I had the courage. That was never I never lacked that. That was not what I was working on. What I had to work on was the serenity to be like, you know what, I can't, this one I need to let go. Um, and so that when I choose to embody that courage next time, I'll have the actual stamina and energy and emotional wholeness to pursue that political tension that I wanted to pursue. And then now, and almost being finished high school, that wisdom to know the difference is, I guess, like a lifelong thing I've just got to keep wrestling with. But really,
For
the
sure.
message is pick your battles, because, while I love these webinars that are about civic engagement, sometimes I feel like there's an undertone, especially for teens, of do everything you possibly can. And I wish someone had said to me, so I will say to the world, like, you actually don't have to do everything, and doing one thing really well or with your whole heart and your whole energy is plenty. And that's the Lo Alecha quote. That's, you don't have to solve climate change, but you can go to the protest, or you don't have to fix the election, but you can go to the letter writing thing next week, something like that.
So one of the things that you're saying is really important to think is that even a small act can be of enormous value. And if
Yeah,
just not to force yourself into like some perfect vision of what it means to be politically active, but to just affirm that some even small things can make a difference. So let me turn to
absolutely.
you. Yeah, great. So Jonah, let me turn to you for a moment. When you think about the time between, let's say, your bar mitzvah and now, your teen years, what do you think have shaped you politically and how you think about politics and engage in conversation around politics?
One of the things that I'm really grateful for is just being able to have conversations with family, friends, just the community around me, because I think that everyone has their own opinions on everything, and just being able to hear other people's opinions, I think, has helped me feel like I can have a more well-rounded opinion myself. One of the places that I notice I get to do this a lot, which I'm really grateful for, is the summer camp that I go to, Camp Galil. And one of the things that's really pushed at Camp Galil is learning and talking about the world. At least once a day, we have a time period just dedicated for talking about issues in the world, whether that's capitalism and socialism, or whether that's the conflict in Israel. They range, but being able to learn how to talk about it and express my opinion with people I trust around me has definitely shaped how I think about and talk about politics today.
Mm, that's great. Not every teenager has that kind of space, so having that kind of space where you can really engage politically is an enormous value. I totally get that. Um, Yael, I know that there are some things that you have really connected to. Like there are movements that have happened. When I think about what's happened just like in the last 5 years, like there's been a lot going on, everything from Black Lives Matter to Dobbs decision to climate crisis. And what are the things that you have thrown yourself into, like the times when you've said, this is something I really do want to speak up on?
Yeah, I think that the Jewish affinity group at my school has been really a space that I have put a lot of my love and time and care. And I think that, when I came into the high school, my first day of high school was on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And I missed my first day of high school and I was really upset about it. I was not in my school photo. I did not get a top locker. It was the most devastating thing ever.
Tragedy.
Um, and that really brought me into the high school with like I really need to find my Jewish community. That passion has 4 years later still kept me going. I really want to make sure that there's a Jewish community for me, and now that I'm a senior, that lives past me at my Quaker school. And I think that I really went into that experience of like Quaker school, Jewish girl, this isn't going to work well. And what I've learned is actually those different spaces, the intersectionality of them really highlight each other. Um, and I am really proud of Jewish Affinity Group. I'm really proud of the way that my school has uplifted another religious group in a religious school. And I'm really, I think that building that Jewish community has always been a gratifying piece of work for me.
Oh, it's amazing to hear that, Yael. And I also think it's like part of why it's like really heartwarming to hear that is I know that for so many Jewish students who are in schools that are where they find themselves minorities, this has been a really challenging year. And in our conversation earlier, Jonah, you told me a little bit about some of the challenges that you've experienced this year, really after October 7th. Could you share a little bit about what it's like, what it's been like for you as a Jewish student with lots of friends who are from all sorts of different other backgrounds, and how you've navigated that experience?
Yeah, after October 7th, there was a big friend group of like 15 of us, and there were a bunch of little smaller friend groups, but someone posted on this group chat that we had with all 15 of us. It was on Discord, it was just a group chat app, saying something like, hey, there's a rally that's happening opposing the genocide in Gaza. And sadly, a few of my friends saying, hey, I can't go to this, ended up with a lot of really hurtful words thrown at both my friends, and also it felt like it was thrown at me too, with a lot of um, uh, anti-Zionist comments, but also what felt like some underlying anti-Semitic tropes. And it was really hurtful, partially because I wanted to say something and point out in this big group chat like, hey, this feels hurtful. But what I realized is that when you're in a big group chat, the speed that it takes you to think through a thoughtful response to give to someone about something that felt problematic that they said is the time that it might take to write 5 really frustrating, harmful comments back to what I had just said. And that just, I'm always 5 steps behind whatever's happening because just the way that online communication sometimes works, and that felt really frustrating. And so at that moment I didn't say anything, and what I did is I reached out to a few of my closer friends, all of whom were in that group, some of whom were, being um, being almost attacked for not showing up to this rally. And I said, hey, can we talk about what happened? And so the next day we went to this picnic table that we often hang out at, and we sat down and we talked. And at the end of the conversation, it wasn't that I had convinced them that, oh, of course, Israel's doing all the right things, because truthfully, I don't believe that myself. But they also weren't trying to sit there convincing me of their political agenda. It was just a space for us to sit down and talk about the frustrating situation that had happened the night before on Discord, but also to feel like we had each other even in that frustrating time. And one of the things I really realized is that these conversations about difficult issues in the world are going to happen. It's not a question of if they're going to happen. It's a question of when they're going to happen, where they're going to happen, and how they happen. Because it can be very easy in the polarized world that we live in to approach a conversation with feeling like you have to convince someone else that your point is right, and that by proxy their point is wrong. And I think that that's something that I've kind of learned, is that that's not the case, and that being able to have conversations where where your only goal is to understand what other people are talking about, and to find a community where you can talk about it even if you don't agree with who you're talking with, is really important.
Well, I mean, it's very mature of you to move it to the picnic table. Let me say that. I don't know if that was you initiating it, but like that sounds amazing. That sounds wise. But I just want to underscore what just the gravity of what you were saying just now, which is that being a Jewish teenager means that you are often in like a group chat experience where you are like, I cannot really speak right now because it will be misinterpreted or it will be spun in a different way. But it is very clear to me that part of what you just said in this story is that there is a lot of peer pressure to agree with people in a group chat or to take sides in a group chat. And that is not fun. When you feel like even if your position is slightly more nuanced or slightly more complex than your friends' positions. So I know that there are also times when you have heard friends or peers say things that like needed, when you needed to speak up, things that maybe needed to be corrected or things that needed like a little bit of like education. Like, can you share just a little bit about what that has been like for you when you had to speak out?
Yeah, I have a one of my closer friends and I were having a conversation at this one time, I remember. And I mentioned doing Israeli dancing at camp. And to me, Israeli dancing doesn't feel super connected to Israel. It's, the dancing that I do with friends because it's fun, because it's there. It's just a fun experience. And he made a comment about oh, Israeli dancing. Oh, that might, I forget exactly what he said, but oh, there's has to be a negative connotation there. And I remember at that moment not saying anything, um, sort of being um, a little confused. It's often hard, I've noticed this just in thinking back on experiences, to respond in the moment, because you can be taken aback by something and just be like, wow, I don't know how to respond to that. And sometimes even responding in the moment isn't the best, but I didn't say anything. I let that comment go, and we were walking, and I just kept walking, and that was it. And I almost felt frustrated with myself that I didn't say anything, because something needed to be said. And a day later, I sent him a note and just said, "Hey, I felt like this was a little bit frustrating." I explained what I just said, is that for me, Israeli dancing is not, it has nothing to do with Israel. It's just a way of expressing myself with friends. And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry. Like I didn't realize that. Again, like I don't have the best views towards Israel, but I'm sorry that my comment was hurtful, and that for you, this thing that felt so important felt diminished by my comment. And I think that was a big learning moment for me, to realize that sometimes confronting things in the moment isn't the best. I know there's a saying that if you write an angry letter, you should put it away until the next morning and make sure you're still okay sending it in the morning. It felt like the same thing to me, that if I had said what I wanted to say then, it would have caused an argument between me and my friend. And just giving me that space to really think about what happened, and also understand that what he had said, he didn't mean to hurt me in that comment, because we do really care for each other. We are really good friends. That just waiting and being able to address it the next day felt very helpful.
That's what sounds like a good resolution there. So I just want to thank you both. Thank you, Yael. Thank you, Jonah, because I think you paint a picture of some of the challenges that teens face right now, which are that you are in situations where, for one reason or another, you have to come up with diplomatic solutions to address people speaking in ways that are either incorrect or ill-informed. And like, that is a challenge in and of itself. That you have had to think creatively about how to create a side conversation in order to address something that can be really hard to address in a group. And I know that, like, whenever you're in a group, especially when you feel like you're a minority and there's like a majority that is feeling a different way, it's even harder to, in some ways get a voice, to have a voice. And both of you, it seems like, are finding strategically like the ways to have a voice, the ways to like make sure that the things that you need to say are being said, and that people can really hear each other. So I want to just start with this, because it's awesome to hear this, that like one of the things that's happening right now, even though there's a lot of craziness, a lot of political polarization, all of that is happening at the same time. There are folks like yourselves that are learning how to navigate the political discourse in a healthy way. I'm sure there are a lot of other teens that are just raging on Twitter or what have you, but at least you are like thinking about what are the alternatives. So I'm now going to turn things over to Dr. Wendy Smith. And Jonah and Yael, we'll see you in a little bit. But now it's time to talk about this amazing book and the ideas in it. Here's the book, Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems. And Wendy, we're going to talk about some tough problems, but at first I want to just share with you the first thing that I thought about when I saw the title of your book. And it is a very old Jewish joke. And it's the old Jewish joke of two people coming to the rabbi. One person says, Rabbi, this is what happened, and I need to, for this reason, I'm the one who needs to get paid. The other person says, and the rabbi says, you're right. And the other person says, no, Rabbi, this is what happened, and I'm the one who needs to get paid. And the rabbi says, you're right. And then the Rebbitzin is over there in the corner saying, how can they both be right? And the rabbi turns and says, you're right. So it's a classic joke about paradox. But it's also just like the way that I think about what is both and thinking. Both and thinking is not just about you're all right. Tell us a little bit about the idea, the concept, and why it is important in this particular context.
Well, Daniel, I love that you start. First of all, thank you for having this webinar, and for such a pleasure to be able to be on a webinar with my children. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, they were amazing. I think
Bubby is somewhere in this audience too, so I'm sure she's following along with us. And thank you for starting there. I have been speaking a lot about this book and the ideas and the concepts, and rarely do I get to start with or acknowledge just how much Jewish tradition, Jewish experience has informed my thinking, and it has pretty profoundly. And in fact, it's an idea, and we can talk about this a little more, informed by multiple different wisdom, religious, theological wisdom, ancient traditions that have all come together. So that is certainly profound.
I know in your book you do talk about Taoism and the
Yeah.
yin yang and the idea of paradox being embedded in that philosophy. So I know it's informed not only by Judaism but by many other faith traditions and wisdom traditions. So can you share a little bit about what this means exactly and the role of paradox in this book and how you approach this work?
Yes, and I love that you introduced me as a business school professor. Certainly my background is I am a business school professor. I am a professor who has brought together psychology and business. That's how
I noticed that in your bio that you studied at Yale, you did psych and political science, then you did a master's at Harvard, then you did a PhD in organizational behavior at Harvard. So I noticed that like you were trying to bring those things together. And I think organizational psych, organizational, I don't know what the title is, leadership or management is very psych oriented, thinking about groups and how they agree or disagree. So tell us a little bit about like what you saw from just your early work. You were looking at the paradoxes that business leaders are facing, and then how do they resolve those paradoxes?
Yeah, and to describe this idea of paradox, and I also love that you went there because that's really at the heart of these ideas. And to unpack it, just to give you some background, I started studying these ideas by studying how senior leaders in organizations navigate tensions like how do we continue to focus on what we do today, do it well, do it effectively, be operationally successful and effective while changing, innovating, and focusing on tomorrow. How do we focus on the short term, the long term, the stability and the change? And really what I went to grad school thinking I was going to study and eventually studying was this issue of how do organizations like big corporations navigate tensions between focusing on the bottom line, revenues, profits, and at the same time thinking about a broader social, environmental agenda, broader social mission agenda. And these things are in conflict with each other. And I remember being a consultant before I went back to grad school. And I remember saying, well, companies have to think about this broader social mission, but they also have to worry about their bottom line. And he said, no, you can't do both. And I remember thinking, well, I'm not sure that's true. I think they have to do both. Well, fast forward, that's what led me to study this in grad school and then introduced me to this age-old idea, but one that we hadn't been talking about when it came to psychology or organizations or people around paradox, around this idea that there are these opposing pressures, competing demands. We like to use, and when I say we, I have this fabulous co-author colleague, Marianne Lewis, and we like to use the yin yang for people who are more abstract, the black sliver and the white sliver, the today, the tomorrow, the social and the financial, the focus on yourself, focus on others, focus, whatever it may be, that really there are conflicting pressures. They conflict for our time and our resources and our attention. And we feel like we have to make a choice between them. But actually, if we look harder, they're interdependent, they're synergistic, they reinforce one another, they create a more holistic, interdependent whole, they come together. And the invitation of, or the idea that emerged through my research, and then the invitation of this book is, can we notice how often we experience problems, whether, I was looking at it for organizations, but in our personal lives, in our everyday experience, work and life, certainly what it's like when we're in a war-torn conflict and we experience of it, it has to be one or the other. Like Jonah was saying, if you're not with me, you're against me, right or wrong. It's like, it has to be. And how often we experience it as a either or, why we do that, and how limiting that can be, and invite in what it looks like to invite in, and how can we shift to a both and, to seeing the possibilities of these coming together simultaneously.
So one of the things that you write about, and I'd like for you to just explain a little bit, is that there are dangers that come about when we start to divide the world the way that politics divides the world, like between left and right, or between, one group wants to take things to the way they used to be, and another group wants to take things forward, or whatever it is that we use to categorize that. Like, what are the dangers of thinking of the world in that way? Isn't the world that way? Aren't there like choices? Like, what are the dangers of this, of seeing the paradox and just saying like these are opposing sides?
Yeah, and by the way, I want to invite people first of all to notice that any tension we experience, underlying that is a paradoxical demand. And some of them even came up in the conversation you were having with Jonah and Yael, this tension Yael is experiencing about wanting to have a voice, but feeling that if you have to have a voice about everything, it becomes so overwhelming. Well, how do we navigate this tension between advocacy and, holding back, know when to hold them, know when to fold them, like, or Jonah, like, how do we both have this tension between wanting to advocate for something, but at the same time wanting to listen and understand? So, these kinds of paradoxes come up all over the place. But your question was about, okay, so we either or them. Why is that a problem? Like, why is it a problem to take a stance and have a conclusive point of view? And certainly in some cases we want to do that. We want to take a stance. We want to, and what we point to, and certainly this is the high level, and we can do a deeper dive, or you can send people to the book. But we, in our research, identify these three patterns of what we call vicious cycles that happen when we take a strong stance and stay committed to it. And just out of empathy, it is natural for us. It is evolutionary. It is psychologically normal for us to want to take a stand and stay committed to that stand and stay consistent with it. That's sort of what we tend to do. But here's why it's problematic. And we say there's three things. The first is that when we take a stand and get committed, we get stuck. We intensify that point of view. We surround ourselves by others by that point of view. We stop hearing the other point of view. We call that falling down a rabbit hole, this intensification. And then when things change, we can't shift. Or when there's other points of view, we can't hear them. So that's one. The second is that, well, sometimes we fall down that rabbit hole of things and focusing, but then when things change, we're like, oh, we have to change, and we overcorrect. We call that the wrecking ball, because the image is you sort of like kill everything along the way. You sort of like throw out the baby with the bathwater. And, this might be trite, but the example I often use for that, because it really is sticky, is if anybody's ever been on a diet, you're disciplined, and then you have that one croissant, and all of a sudden, okay, I'm throwing it all away, and I'm just like, forgetting it all. So like that sense that, and we see this kind of pattern in our politics, this like massive shifts that we make from left to right in our politics, rather than we just have to throw out everything of the past in order to get to the next step. And that becomes like these detrimental swings. And the third, and this is where we're finding is most pernicious, and this is perhaps the space that if I most want to pass something along to my kids, it's to be aware of this, which is this polarization that we're talking about. This idea that if we take a stand, what we tend to do is we surround ourselves by others. We're right. The others have to be wrong. We dismiss the other point of view. We dehumanize. We don't even know the other point of view. With this massive polarization where we can't even listen to or connect with others. And we use the metaphor of that of trench warfare, because the idea is that you can just imagine in war, like you're digging your own trench and surrounding yourselves by others that are on your side, agreeing with you, supporting you, reinforcing you, and you're shooting out at the other side without even understanding them. Like you've just dehumanized the other side as the enemy, and you're just shooting out at them without connecting. And that's hard to overcome, but that is, I think, the state in which we find ourselves right now in our country, certainly the state and the conversation that I'm experiencing around the Middle East, that it's hard to find the middle ground and be able to pull together opposing ideas, because it just feels such like an existential threat, and we have to just hold our position so strongly.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, all three of those are really interesting to me, but the last one, the trench warfare, it really matches onto what I've noticed, particularly with teenagers and their psychology, which is that they look at the other side and they imagine whatever the other side is, they take the most extreme voice of that other side and say they all believe in that one voice. Like there's a way that, in particular, I see this because of social media and the way that social media just like lifts up the most extreme voices. So I'm seeing that a lot, just because that's the nature of the medium that they're mostly immersing themselves in. But this idea that like, and they're like, both sides are dehumanizing, but they only think that that side is dehumanizing and their side is humanized. Like that.
Yeah, Daniel, I want to lift up two things that you just said. One is that we are in a world right now where the conversations, social media, even the media, right? If you look at the media, the media has become polarized. And the way that the media portrays and models conversations is through taking a very strong stance and being super aggressive about it. And what we don't have in front of us are, and social media exacerbates that. What we don't have in front of us and what we're not putting effectively, I think, in front of our teens are role models of civil discourse, as you said, role models, effective role models of being in conversation, of listening, of being able to engage with people that we don't agree with. Those are harder to come by. And I think that's a real miss, number one. And then the second piece that I want to highlight is that, indeed, that is the brains of a child, the brain of a teenager to sort of make those distinctions. But I remember when I was when our kids were little and we were raising smaller kids, and people would say to me, but you got to just live into that black and white thinking of kids because that's developmentally where they are. And that's sort of the Erik Erikson, like at a developmental stage, you're working through those differences, and we just have to honor the black and white and give them the really clear choices. There's also psychology that says, you know what, kids can really learn the skills of engaging that more complex thinking even from a younger age. And so, look, I don't know that we do it well, and I don't know how, I'm very proud of my teenagers and certainly, but certainly from a younger age, we would start asking our kids, inviting them into well, what would the other side say? Well, this might be one perspective, what might be another perspective? Or how do you explore different ways of thinking about it? Or how did you ask about? I think that it's a miss when we don't teach. I think or let me say it differently. There's huge opportunity to teach at a young age, and certainly our teenagers, and model for them the opportunity of being in conversation in which you can listen to and engage with a different perspective that you don't necessarily agree with, but that you can sit in the discomfort of listening and understanding.
Yeah, I know that in the discourse around echo chambers, a lot of people are saying like one of the things we're not exposing young people to is a diversity of viewpoints. And like how do you get them to engage with the diversity of viewpoints, even if they're not speaking with people who hold those viewpoints? Just how do you understand that you're living in a world where there are people who think very differently about the role of government, the way the economy should be, what rights people should have and shouldn't have, like, some of the basic political questions. So I do think that that's really important to just point out that there are these, as you describe them, vicious cycles that have eroded a lot of our ability to navigate a path forward. So let's talk about that path forward.
Daniel, can I just comment on that before we go to
Oh yeah, for sure.
Because I want to put a fine point on that. There's two pieces to, I think, the exposure and the skills. And I want to put a finer point on what they are. One is, are you being exposed to a different point of view than you have experienced? But you could be exposed to that and still be shouting at the TV that it's wrong and stupid and ridiculous. And, I'll just lift up for a second. Jonah, for his AP government class, has to watch the news. And the assignment is 1 week to watch the news. And as we know, the news is now increasingly politicized. So watch the news from one political perspective and then watch the news from the other political perspective. So that's exposure, but that's not necessarily being able to acknowledge and engage that oppositional side, because oftentimes we're watching the perspective that is not the one that's dominant in our family, and we're upset with it, and so I think that in addition to being exposed to different points of view, not being in the echo chamber, the other skill that I think is really critical is the skill of being able to be in dialogue, listen, engage with people who have a different point of view. That's a skill. And maybe that's what takes us into this next piece about, well, how do you do that? But certainly one of the things about both and thinking that we highlight is that's a skill of noticing how often you're either oring, being able to notice how the opposite side might trigger you emotionally, being able to sit and listen and ask and engage and be curious, or share your point of view and advocate, but in a respectful way with someone who believes something deeply and different than you, that's a skill. And it's one that, I don't think that we teach well. As you said, I'm a professor at the University of Delaware. The first thing that for me happened after October 7th was to say, how can we as a university, like there's work to do to make sure that truths and understanding happen on both sides. There's also work to do in the skill of how do we get people to talk across both sides respectfully. And that's where my mind went, was how could we start teaching this more effectively? If we're going to teach anything at a higher university level, how do we teach that skill?
So I'm going to turn to you with that question now,
Yeah.
because I can think of a lot of people that I know that like it's hard to imagine them even engaging in a conversation where they can hear each other, because almost all the language that they use to describe problems is like a kind of insider language with their own group. And like there isn't even shared language between them about how do you describe the situation or the problem that they're talking about. So where do you start when you have people that are really seeing the world differently and you're trying to find a way forward?
Yeah. Well, I think the first piece of that is know when to have, what conversations to have with who, when. And
Okay,
so,
sure.
Jonah said this, not on social media. I think that too often we turn to social media and just get off social media. That is not a useful, or don't get off, get off social media. Whatever. Don't have this conversation mediated by social media, because it doesn't allow for the kind, you have to start with respect and connection. That's the first place. So don't do it if you're on social media. Second of all, don't do it if you don't think that you can have the emotional capacity to do it. Like if you think that you're going to be so triggered that you won't be able to engage, don't do it. This is an opportunity. And then the third piece is use this opportunity as a chance to learn. So I think an important distinction is, where are the spaces in which we advocate, and where are the spaces in which we try and understand and learn? And not every space has to be effective for each of those. So I love the opening song, Use Your Voice. Yes. And I wanted to add to that, use your ears. We've got to learn to use our ears to open up, listen, and connect with other people. That's hard. So could we just differentiate? This conversation might not be about me advocating and using my voice and teaching somebody. It's about me connecting and making and understanding. And I'm going to engage in this conversation by just opening up with super curiosity about the other person's point of view. I have a colleague here we're in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, Sharon Browning has a organization called Just Listening. And she describes it as listening is an act of justice. I want to be clear. We're not saying don't advocate, don't use your voice, don't clarify when points are wrong, but also, this is a both and. Also, be ready to, or use the capacity, use the skills to listen and hear and understand somebody else's point of view, even if you don't agree with it. Listening doesn't mean agreeing. It just means offering somebody enough respect that you're going to listen. And I'll just say one more thing to this, which is that sometimes I think, if we can turn the tables, we just want to be listened to. We want people to hear our point of view. We don't always need them to agree. And maybe if we can remember how valuable that would be for us, we can offer that as a gift to others.
So I want to affirm that, and I do affirm it. Like I think about just like the dignity that you give somebody when you listen to them. But at the same time, when I think about that, I know that there are things that when people say those things, every single hair in my body stands up, and I'm just like wanting to defend or to say that isn't true, or to say like, where are you getting your information from, or whatever it is. So there are a lot of landmines, I would say, that listening brings about. Like, I don't want to tolerate somebody saying things that are vile or racist or hateful. I don't want to tolerate it. So like asking me even to listen is a challenge.
Yeah.
So I, and at the same time, I want to just affirm what you're saying and affirm what your colleague has taught, is that we have to start with a listening approach, because otherwise we're just there to yell at somebody ultimately, or tell people what to think, and that's not going to get us anywhere. So I do want to think about the role of listening, but I know that in your book you get into some of the strategies about how people navigate difference. You talk about in one case the metaphor of the mule, a cross between a horse and a donkey is a mule, and then another case you talk about the images tightrope walking, walking a tightrope. Could you explain a little bit like what these ideas capture? How is it that we can navigate across difference using those kinds of tools?
Yeah, I so want to respond to that. Can we just go back to listening for 30 seconds and then go move forward to those, if that's okay?
You got it.
I want to make sure that this is not misconstrued. I certainly am not saying listen only and never advocate. There is a professor, Chris Argyris, who talks about sort of conversation skills. So sort of the father of action design conversation skills, and talked about the conversation styles of advocacy and inquiry. And a key, every time I teach this and invite people to look at their conversations, a key aha is that people advocate like 90% of the time. We're telling people stuff, and we inquire, we listen, we ask, we're curious about like 10%. And so the invitation here is to do two things. The second thing that Chris Argyris says is that the value of a conversation is to solve a problem, convey an idea, but it's also to learn, and it's also to build relationships. But we're so busy conveying an idea that we miss out on the learning and the building relationships. And more importantly, if we do the learning and the building relationships, which comes from us asking and inquiring, we can actually convey our point of view to somebody who's more open to hearing it. So what I'm suggesting here is that the listening, the advocacy, the curiosity, the questioning, that we don't do it enough, that we tilt so far to the advocacy that we need to shift back a little bit, and that doing that will actually create the conditions to allow us to have voice and say, hey, gosh, when you say that, my hair stands on ends, because that is so not true, or that is like you're missing something. But that's like, you have a much more open channel for doing that if you have a respectful relationship and they know that they're being heard and valued.
Yeah, I really like that corrective. All right, now let me go back to this idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mules, tight ropes, how are these ways of, and particularly now I'm just going to start to focus us on the topic for tonight, which is navigating difference with you and your teenager. Like, what are these strategies, and how might these strategies inform how you might approach a conversation with a teenager when you are not seeing eye to eye?
Yes. Gosh. Well, first of all, when it comes to the teenagers, I now I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but indeed, I think that listening and respecting our teenagers and giving them the space, especially if they have a different point of view than us, is super hard and also super important. I remember when I was in my 20s and I was living in Israel, a good friend of mine had a list of like the top rebellions that our kids, our future kids might one day have. And like right at the top of the list was that they would advance a different political party than us. Like how, the idea that our kids have different points of view than us is really damning. Like here we've raised them to believe certain things. That's hard. And I think that's actually probably the first space in which could we sit with our kids and give them the respect that we can hear and listen to their point of view without telling them what they have to believe. And so I think there is a space, if we're talking about navigating politics with our teens, I mean, I don't know that we're always great about that in our household, but that's what we strive for, which is let us create the conditions where you have a point of view and we could hear it along the way. That said, I'm happy to talk about mules and tightrope walking.
Yeah, let's go. Let's go. I think, you you might be saying, I'm ready to listen to my teen, but you may come to a different place, and you may have different values that are guiding you. And you may be at that point where you're like saying, well, maybe we can't do any politics together, or this is not part of a relationship anymore. And that's hard. That's really hard. So how do you find some common ground when you were in a situation where people really are coming at something from a completely different perspective, or different language, or different value systems really dominating the way they're making their decisions?
Yeah, the number one thing that we say in the book in terms of shifting a point of view is to notice how often we either or, just lift that up and then shift that to a both and. And in this situation, what would it look like to effectively articulate between two people, whether that's you and your teenager, or whether that's you and your coworker, hey, like there is a possible both and here, that and honor that. I mean, that's a hard part, because again, some of these political positions feel really existential, but can I create space for another point of view that I don't agree with, or at least acknowledge that there is another point of view and I will listen to it, or I will engage with it, or I will respect that you have a different point of view than me. Super hard. So can you shift to that language of there is a both and? And in fact, I've been doing a whole lot of speaking about both ands, a lot in companies, some in foundations and organizations. One of the key pieces that people walk away with is just that shift of language. Oh, this is an either or. How can I get to a both and? Now, I want to be clear, like I realize it's easier to get to a both and if we're talking, or it seems easier to get to a both and if we're talking about both. We need to accommodate, the R&D folks and the finance folks. That's, but I remember soon after October 7th, and at our synagogue, we did a session on both and thinking. And we said, well, what does it look like now to both and this conflict? And somebody said, oh, it's all good to both and, whatever, like we can both and what it means to have a kashrut policy in our shul. But when it comes to this, there is no both and. Well, indeed, that is what it feels like. But what does it mean? But there are people who have very different points of view. Can we listen to them? So that's number one. When it comes to, and you were sort of mentioning this idea of mules and tightrope walkers, the key idea there, and I think the important idea, is that when I first did the research, or when I first started my research for my PhD, and I was going out to explore how these senior leaders were making decisions, and they would say, yes, we're looking for a both and. What I was always expecting was that, okay, well, a both and means that there's going to be this ideal win-win, and that win-win was going to allow for, like this ideal situation where everybody is happy. And, we call that the mule, because the mule is this image of, like, it's actually the oldest biological hybrid. People have been bringing together the donkey and the horse for a really long time to create mules. Like
humans figured out to get the animal world to work for us. Yes.
Exactly, the animal world to work for us. So it's this like biological hybrid that is smarter than a donkey, stronger than a horse. You bring it together, you've got a mule. Bring it, a win-win, a creative integration. And what I found in my research is that happens sometimes. But in fact, what I found more often happening in these companies was that the kinds of decisions that they were making was that over time, they were accommodating competing demands, opposing perspectives, but they were doing it by making these micro shifts between opposing ideas so that they would sometimes shift. And so in this case, it was, how were they navigating social responsibility? Well, sometimes our decisions were a little bit more focused on a financial reality and sometimes more focused on a social reality. Or how do you accommodate, like Yael said, wanting to both be an activist and advocate, but at the same time feeling exhausted? Well, sometimes you're going to lean in and make the case and pick your battle. And sometimes you're going to say, this fight is not mine. I'm not going to engage on this fight. And you're going to make those choices. And that's okay, because over time, you're accommodating. So in Yael's case, a world where she can take care of her well-being while still be an activist and an ally on the issues that she wants to, or in the business situation, or, sometimes you're going to lean more into work and more into the rest of your life, or sometimes you're going to lean into listening, and sometimes you're going to lean into advocating, and sometimes you're going to lean into engaging with your teenager on issues, and sometimes you're going to say, I'm going to let this go. And as long as you are not, the idea, we call this tightrope walking, because for the tightrope walker to go forward, they're never fully balanced on the tightrope. They're always balancing. And they're making these micro shifts between left and right. But they're not overextending to one side that they fall off. They're not. So if you're Yael, you're not overextending like she did in middle school, that she has to fight every single battle, because then she just gets exhausted. She's now in this more nuanced micro shifting of, which battle am I going to fight? How am I going to fight it? And which one am I going to let go of? Because that's going to enable my, overall well-being to continue to fight the battles that I want to fight. And so that's what we call tightrope walking.
That's great. So I just want to share a few of the things that folks wrote in before this webinar that were on the top of their minds, because I think what you're offering are ways for us to think about how to move forward, starting with a disposition and a stance and a commitment to increasing the amount of listening and decreasing the amount of lecturing, and also just saying that sometimes things can be integrated. Sometimes integration is not possible, but you might have a negotiation or navigation between things. So here are some of the things that we heard from folks that joined us tonight. People are wondering, like, how do they talk to their teens when their teens are really feeling like this is a social justice issue and I can only hear exactly the way that I feel about this. When teens are feeling like this is too emotional, they don't want to even engage with a parent about the topic. We heard that people are really concerned about teens that are in online bubbles, and that they have algorithms that maybe even they've fallen into a place of conspiracy theory, and they are starting to spout ideas that are really outside of the mainstream. So what do you say to, like, a parent who is in a situation where they have a teen who they are really concerned about, like how they're thinking about politically? What are the ways that they should approach the teen? Like, and there are a lot of different cases, obviously, but what are some of your thoughts about that, the realities of parents who are, you're not sure what media your teens are exposed to, you don't know where they're getting their ideas from, and you don't really want to respect their ideas because those ideas may be really out of bounds. What are your thoughts on that?
Whew, Daniel, that's,
well, this is what's on people's minds. I
get that. I just want to sort of make a disclaimer. In some cases, some of these situations might be at the level of really needing professional help. We've seen this increased spike in depression and extremism of kids, and there are cases where there's really a need for professional help, and I certainly don't want to espouse any claims on being able to offer that's important. And when we need professional help, we should go and seek it, because at the extreme, we certainly want our kids to be more healthy. And we're seeing this increase in mental health challenges for kids. That said, I remember when again, Jonah and Yael were little, and we were in my we were visiting my father-in-law, and on his bookshelf, and I remember this being on my parents' bookshelf too, was this like classic 1970s book, Parent Effectiveness Training. Some people on the webinar might remember this. And then there was Teacher Effectiveness Training. And I remember reading it, and even though the pages were falling out because the glue on the binding was, sort of coming off, like the ideas in that book, and then the ideas in many of the parenting books that I read since, like How to Talk So Your Kids Will Listen and How to Listen So Your Kids Will Talk, or Positive Parenting, or whatever your favorite parenting book, like a key underlying theme, which in some ways I think has infused how I think about both, and is this underlying idea of treating your kids with respect and then approaching them with curiosity and inviting them to reflect on their own thinking. So on one hand, there is space to be able to tell share with your kids, what you believe, but I think that we particularly do that through two ways. One is to role model how to be healthy political adults in the world, how to be curious adults in the world. So maybe the first question is to check how we are engaging around those topics and what they're seeing from us. And maybe what they're doing is they're seeing us take a very strong stance, and they're taking this, doing the same exact thing, but on the opposing side. So let's check our own behaviors. I remember when we went to a social media talk at our kids' school when they were young, and before our kids had their phones, and the guidance counselors finally came up and said, you're all talking about how worried you are about your kids being on the phone all the time. The biggest problem we're seeing is actually the parents calling the kids and the parents being on the phone. So check our own behaviors and how we engage as a starting point. And then I think the second piece is can we start with empathy for what they're dealing with? It's a hard world out there right now. You were asking, when you asked Yael, I think she was talking about the overwhelm. I mean, there's the overwhelm of having to deal with climate change and racial injustice and this political election, which is so heated, and then throw on top of that what it means to be a Jew trying to navigate these really difficult moments post October 7th. That's a lot. And so how do we start with some empathy for our kids and curiosity, and invite them into what's going on for them, and then invite them into reflecting on, well, how are they thinking about approaching all of this?
Yeah, I often think about that my own children went through more change than I went through during my adolescence. During my adolescence, there were, of course, things that were going on, but it was relatively calm compared to living through a pandemic, living through civil unrest, living through the largest demonstrations since the civil rights movement, which was Black Lives Matter, all of those things, living through January 6th and the chaos of January 6th, all of the things that they have experienced, on top of the other things that you mentioned. So I do think a lot about that, just starting with a sense of, wow, your generation is going through a lot. I have a lot to learn from that. I don't know everything about that, but I also just want to make space for us to be able to talk about what's going on, and for me to share how I perceive what's going on, and to hear how you're perceiving it. Just those guidelines, I think, are really helpful. So we wanted to we know that.
I just want to say one other thing, because I want to lift
Sure.
up, one of you guys did a great webinar that everybody here should go back and listen to on Israel at Your Kitchen Table about a year ago. And this was something that you were espousing a year ago in, the early stages of post October 7th. And how do you invite in that kind of conversation among your teens? So everybody should go back and listen to that as well, because I think this is a really consistent theme that comes through the webinars that you guys do.
Great. Well, we're trying to be consistent and, and be of the moment. So I also just want to invite people. Some people wrote in before, but if you have a thought, I wish that my teen would blank, that is on your mind right now, we're going to drop an answer garden into the chat. And you can just go into the answer garden and click on that link and add your responses. I wish my teen would blank. 2 or 3 words added into that, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. So we're getting ready to wrap up here, but let me just give one last question for you, Wendy, and then we're going to bring Yael and Jonah back into the conversation. So when you think about your own perspective on these issues and what you've learned over almost 2 decades of teaching, when you think about that, what do you feel like, if you could create it, if you had unlimited funds or you had the power to create something, what would you do to address some of the deeply entrenched vicious cycles that you see in the world? What is the big dream or the big picture? What could really address some of the things that you've been researching?
I would invite people into opportunities to learn to name the underlying emotional challenges the fears, the anxieties that lead us down these rabbit holes, these polarizing positions, and to practice the skills, to learn the skills, to be in these conversations. I'm a huge fan, if anybody has been engaged with an organization called Braver Angels, that is teaching skills around these kind of conversations in American politics. I would love to teach this around Middle East politics, just the invitation to notice our emotional triggers, be able to name them. Don't let them define our behaviors. We talk about finding comfort in the discomfort and learning to be able to engage others, to invite others into conversation and sit with that. It's hard.
Yes, it is.
Particularly hard when it's our kids.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So let's go with that, because I saw that we had one of the responses that we had to this question was, having my child understand how I think about what's going on in Gaza, for example. And I'm not assuming one way or the other of how the parent thinks or how the teen thinks, but I do think that there is something that is particularly challenging for us as American Jews when we're thinking about how we talk about the Middle East. And it's coming up in this election quite a bit. It's coming up because I noticed that there's a lot of talk about Jews and their influence, and that makes us all uncomfortable. And there's a lot of conversation about American policy right now. And we're all in this moment where, I don't know about you, but like I am looking at the news every morning when I wake up to see if this war is escalating further and how much further, and to thinking like, are we just going to be headed into multiple months of escalating war as we go into this election? So it's a scary time, but I do think it is important to talk a little bit about this very thing. What are the generational differences? So I'd like to bring back both Yael and Jonah, and like to like just talk a little bit about. Hey Yael, hey Jonah, welcome back. You can unmute. So I wanted to say a little bit about this. Like I started out talking a little bit about the sources of news, like how my kids are watching like YouTube commentators, and I'm like, honestly, I'm still reading the like weekend New York Times. Okay, I'm like such an old dude that I read the paper. I know it's just crazy that I read a newspaper, but I enjoy it. And I read other things too, but like that is an important part of my like news diet. What do you see in the generational differences when we're talking about the Middle East? I mean, like, I'd just like to throw that out there for both of you. Like, how do you think of how do parents like understand it? How do teens understand it? Or what do you think parents are influenced by or reading? And what do you think teens are influenced by or reading? Just, and there's no right or wrong answer. Just thinking about what you see, what you experience, and Yael or Jonah.
Jonah, you go first. I'm making a thought in my brain.
Okay, you make your thought. Jonah, go for it.
I think that all media is going to give a slightly different representation of a situation. And problematically, as we've been talking about, the media is becoming increasingly polarized. For media to keep your attention, they have to get you riled up about how the other side is doing something wrong and being inhumane. And I think that that is problematic because it's becoming increasingly hard to, as my mom was saying, listen to the other perspective in a way that's not harmful, and to just listen. And part of the beauty of listening, especially when it's with a friend, is that when you listen to them and are able to at least understand what they believe, it then opens it up for them to hopefully listen to you and hear what you believe. And I think that there are so many different media sources that portray similar and different ideas. It can be, and that also want to keep viewer attraction, because to be fair, that is how they get money. That it's hard to hear a view that is not yours in a way that is productive and kind and not harmful.
Okay, got you. I mean, again, I think it's what's important to stress about what you're saying is that there's an alternative to like the polarized conversation, and most of the time that is like trying to find an in-person conversation where you can really listen. All right. Yeah, Ella, is that thought baked?
Yes, I have a thought now.
Okay.
Your question was about, the differences that I notice in generations. I want to start with my grandma. My grandma is older than Israel. I know, crazy. And I think in the way that I've had conversations with her, it feels like there's almost this like protective, like maybe that's just grandmotherliness, I don't know, but I know, I think that there's like this protective of like, we got this gift, like a child almost, and we have to protect it. And there's this like parent, like, you can critique your child, but at the end of the day, it's like, that's your kid. And then I think with my parents, what I feel like, or their generation more widely, what I see is this like generational value need to like to vouch for Israel and its existence in a way that's like, this is our friend, and like we need to hype up the homies, if you know what I mean.
Okay, I've never heard it that way, but that's amazing that you.
But like, I just feel like there's this
That's
like
great.
There's this level of like, I need to protect, like I can disagree and I can be angry with, but at the end of the day, there's some level of like camaraderie with like Israel and its existence. And I feel like with my generation, Israel's almost like, okay, I can't extend this relationship metaphor any further, but
you've done so well already. I don't expect you to like be perfect.
I think
here.
it's like, and this isn't everyone, and this is much more nuanced than I'm going to say it, but there's this level of like, gosh, Israel's the reason I feel so attacked on social media, or gosh, Israel's the reason that I see my parents losing, their cool at a Shabbat dinner table, or there's this sort of resentment towards Israel of like, even if, you are pro-Israel Zionist, want to make Aliyah, and I have friends like that, and I also have friends who are like, gosh, Israel's the worst thing that's ever, like the bane of my existence, because if it weren't for Israel, I wouldn't have to be dealing with everything. And I think that there is some level of, because we're not my grandma's generation, we're not older, we don't remember the birth of Israel, that wasn't a part of our lifetime. There's a level of like association of Israel with the reason that some of my friends are being bullied, or the reason that we don't feel safe on social media, and that breaks my heart. But I think that is where I feel like me and some of my friends are at, of resentment.
Yael, that was enormously helpful, and actually a really accurate framing of some of the generational differences. Probably as good as anything I've ever heard from any expert. So that was great. Jonah, hearing that, do you want to add anything to what your sister said?
I think she's definitely right that today it can feel, being in social media and feeling attacked. I told you the story of feeling attacked by my friends on social media. It can feel like, well, of course that only happened because of Israel. And it's definitely true that there is some level of blame or frustration, at the very least, from a lot of young Jewish teens about the place that they're put in because of Israel. And I think that does that can definitely cause tensions between generations, where I remember I wrote an essay on this recently, on feeling like I have to balance these ideas. And one of the things I reference is I remember a conversation just with a friend in the community at a Shabbat dinner, where they said, I heard the stories from my grandma who lived through the Holocaust. Even maybe I don't think they were a Holocaust survivor, specifically, but they like lived through that time and feeling so frustrated and really feeling like they needed a place to fit in, a place for the Jewish people to be together. And then Israel was created, and that was incredible. And I think when you lived through that or heard your grandparents talk about that time is very different than growing up now feeling frustrated with Israel because of the situation they're putting you in terms of friend groups. And even if you support Israel, I think that just those two perspectives alone of hearing the stories and that experience is a very big generational divide in this issue.
So I'm just so incredibly moved by this because I was thinking, I started out the question about the generational divide, and Yael and Jonah, you both beautifully articulated like the role of grandparents in the conversation. And that to me is just so humbling and just so rooted in a sense. Like, I truly believe, and I know there's a lot of research from Marshall Duke about this, like when you know yourself that you carry multiple generations within you, like it is a source of resilience and strength. And so some of the things that you were saying about just like understanding your grandparents' experience and carrying that with you, or thinking about that at a conversation like someone else's grandparent, just that to me is just an incredible reminder of not only thinking about the political perspective between parent and teen, but also thinking about the generations and just like where we come from, and like how all of that is also in the room. All of those emotions are also at the table. It is really challenging. We are going through, like, again, in the Jewish life, we talk about Ein chadash tachat hashemesh. There's nothing new under the sun. Like every generation is the same. And it's also true that every generation is unique. Every individual and human is unique. And like, that is also
that it's a both and.
It's a both and. So that's a perfect place to end our conversation. Thank you all. Really, thank you to the Smith-Posner clan. Really appreciate all of you. Thank you for engaging in this conversation. It was the very first time we started off with teens, and we ended up ending with the teens, which is pretty beautiful. And Wendy, just hearing about your research, I want to encourage people to buy your book, Both and Thinking. It's right here from the Harvard Business Review Press. That's where you'll find it. I just want to say thank you to everybody who joined us on Raising Up Teens. We always have a survey, a little evaluation. We'll drop it in the chat for folks to give us feedback on Raising Up Teens. Just want to tell you a little bit about Moving Traditions for those folks who are new to us. We really believe that every teen has the ability to find their path, and their path should include shlemut, pursuing knowledge and personal wholeness, chesed, loving kindness, developing supportive and healthy relationships and connecting to a community, and tzedek, cultivating commitment to inclusion, equity rooted in feminism and in Judaism. That is our mission. That's what we do in all of the programs of Moving Traditions. We offer communities so many different programs. It was great that we had tonight Yael and Jonah, because they both were part of teen groups. And that's one of the programs that we have here on this slide. We offer also B-Mitzvah family education for 5th through 7th graders and their parents, Kulam, which is for camps and for classrooms for middle school and high school kids, teen groups, and Culture Shift, as well as leadership programs. Yael is part of Koleinu, which is an amazing leadership program that we have for 9th through 12th grade teens, the Teen Feminist Fellowship. We also have a wonderful program, Kumi, for 10th through 12th graders, which focuses also on race in addition to anti-Semitism. So that is an incredible program. And then there is this, which is the Raising Up Teens, which we, again, welcome you to be part of. Please subscribe and join us for our next conversation. Thank you all again for being present, for your questions, for sending in your thoughts before the webinar. We truly, truly appreciate it. And until next time, shalom.